A murder draped in elegance, and a clue hidden in black velvet. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axon. I love hearing from this amazing community. Tell me where you're listening from today. Your comments always make these mysteries come alive. Now let's begin. Market Flaxborough, that stout little town of narrow streets and tidy consciences, had not seen genuine drama since the mayor's chain went missing during the Civic Ball of 1973, and was later found inside a floral arrangement. Thus, when the annual Flaxborough Dramatic Society's spring production promised a daring psychological thriller, expectations ran high among those who secretly preferred pantomime. On the evening in question, the town hall's stage curtains, black velvet, slightly singed at the hem by last winter's heater mishap, hung with tragic grandeur. Beneath them, Mrs. Eunice Pomeroy, director and local authority on modern staging techniques, fluttered about like a self-conscious sparrow, instructing her cast in tones alternating between grandeur and despair. "Projection, Colin, projection! This is theatre, not a Rotary luncheon!" she cried toward the leading man, who was valiantly attempting to look brooding in a velvet smoking jacket. From the back row, Miss Faversham, retired governess, front row subscriber, and moral compass of the Women's Institute, sniffed into her program. "I do wish they'd choose something cheerful," she murmured to her companion. "I've had quite enough psychological tension from my electricity bill." At precisely 8:30, the play began. The first act passed without catastrophe, save for one curtain rope that refused to descend in time with its fellow. Then, during the second act, a scene involving betrayal, a glass of sherry, and what was supposed to be an unloaded revolver, there came a noise quite unscripted. It was not the kind of sound Flaxborough folk associated with entertainment. A short, startling crack, followed by a long pause in which the audience seemed collectively to forget how to breathe. For several seconds, the cast froze, each waiting for another to turn this moment into farce. It was Mrs. Pomeroy who moved first, clapping her hands together in forced gaiety. "Keep going, darlings. The show must— oh, good heavens." Her voice faltered as Colin, still seated on the chaise longue, slumped gently sideways. The audience, relieved to believe it part of the performance, applauded. By the time the applause faded, and someone thought to fetch the St. John's ambulance man from the foyer, Colin Derry, aged 34, clerk of the Borough Planning Office and amateur tragedian, was decidedly dead. The curtain was lowered, with some effort and one snapped pulley, and the murmuring began. Quiet at first, then rising like the tide against the theatre walls. "He was ever so pale, wasn't he?" whispered Mrs. Teal, who ran the hat shop. "I said to Frank he didn't look well enough for all that emoting." "Faint, probably," said Miss Faversham, who disliked tragedy but adored explanations. "Stage fright, you mark my words." In the narrow lane outside the town hall, Constable Love, newly transferred from the traffic division and looking rather dashing in his ill-fitting tunic, radioed the station. "It looks," he said hesitantly, "like one of the actors has gone and died." "On stage, sir." The voice that replied was calm, level, and faintly amused. "Very well, love. Keep everyone in place until I arrive." Inspector Purbright, who had been reading the Evening Argus in his office and finishing a cold cup of tea, folded the paper neatly and rose. He was not surprised. Drama, in his experience, seldom confined itself to the stage. When he entered the town hall, the atmosphere was curiously subdued. The audience had been shepherded into the foyer, where coffee was being served for shock. Inside the auditorium, the body of Colin Derry lay respectfully covered with a spare tablecloth borrowed from the refreshments table. Mrs. Pomeroy hovered near the wings, alternating between grief and indignation. "It was supposed to be blanks, Inspector," she said tremulously. "I was most particular. The prop gun's been used for 5 years. There's never been a misfire." Purbright nodded, his expression mild. "I see. And who was responsible for preparing it tonight?" Mrs. Pomeroy dabbed at her forehead. "Mr. Gorringe, the props master. He's terribly reliable. Does the church lighting as well." "Indeed." Purbright's gaze wandered toward the small table where the revolver rested, incongruously elegant against its setting of velvet and dust. "Reliable men, Mrs. Pomeroy, are very useful in a play, though in life they sometimes have conflicting schedules." Outside, the street lamps glowed through a thin drizzle. Already whispers were darting from one end of the high street to the other. The Argus would by morning have 2 versions of the story ready, one for the cautious editor, and another, more colorful, for when confirmation of tragedy arrived. At the window of the King's Head, Mr. and Mrs. Harbottle were already dissecting events with the surgical precision of those who had witnessed nothing but imagined everything. "Well," said Mr. Harbottle, "that's theatre for you, all passion and no safety precautions." Mrs. Harbottle sipped her gin with satisfaction. "Mark me, Bert, it'll come out that there's been some carry-on behind the scenes. They always have carry-ons." In the town hall, Purbright stood looking at the stage, where the last traces of glamour were fading with the smell of grease paint and candle wax. His constable hovered nearby, notebook open, pen poised for great discoveries. "Sir," Love ventured, "do you think it was an accident?" Purbright gave the faintest of smiles. "Constable, in Flaxborough, an accident is generally someone else's fault. We shall, of course, be polite enough to confirm whose." He looked once more at the revolver, then at the pale face beneath the tablecloth. The velvet curtain stirred faintly in the draught. It seemed to Purbright that somewhere, unseen among the rows of empty seats, the next act had already begun. By morning, Flaxborough had metabolized the news into something resembling folklore. It was not so much that Colin Derry had been murdered, that was too coarse a word, but that he had come to an unfortunate end in circumstances demanding explanation. Mrs. Harbottle said this at the grocer's, with the slow satisfaction of one who knew her phrasing would travel. Within an hour, the postmistress repeated it almost verbatim to the milkman, who admired its delicacy of expression, though he hadn't the faintest notion what it meant. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, was at his desk, reviewing Constable Love's notes from the previous night. The handwriting looked as though a nervous spider had attempted calligraphy. "Quite thorough," Purbright murmured. "You've captured the atmosphere, at least." Love colored modestly. "Thank you, sir. I thought I ought to note how everyone looked." Mrs. Pomeroy was crying. Miss Faversham said the play was too modern, and Mr. Gorringe, he was polishing the gun, sir. Purbright looked up, eyes mild. "Polishing it?" "Yes, sir. Said he couldn't think how the thing went off, so he was cleaning the barrel to see if there was a blockage." The inspector smiled faintly. "An industrious man. I should like to speak to him again, preferably before he polishes away all the evidence he doesn't know he's left." They found Mr. Gorringe at the town hall, wrestling with a stack of scenery flats. A pale man of indeterminate age, with a talent for perspiring even in cold weather, he greeted Purbright with the nervous civility of someone long accustomed to official inquiries about faulty wiring, unauthorized storage, or the occasional missing bulb from the vicarage. "I can't think what went wrong, Inspector," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that had already given up. "I loaded the revolver myself. Only blanks, I swear. Same as every year." Purbright regarded him kindly. "And where do you keep these blanks, Mr. Gorringe?" "In the props cupboard, sir. Locked, of course. Only me and Mrs. Pomeroy have the key. Well, and Colin, he had one too, for rehearsals. Needed it for the big scene, you see." "I do." Purbright turned the revolver over in his hand. "A Webley, isn't it? Heavy old thing. Rather a romantic choice for amateur dramatics. Mr. Gorringe flushed with pride. "Oh, yes, sir. From my uncle's collection. Real piece of history, that." Purbright nodded, as though commending the man's cultural stewardship, then glanced toward the cupboard. "May I?" The props cupboard proved to be an archaeological site of forgotten productions, faded wigs, papier-mâché busts, one stuffed ferret, and an alarming number of swords fashioned from broom handles. On a high shelf sat a small tin marked "Blanks for stage use." Inside were 3 cartridges. Purbright examined them in silence, then closed the tin carefully. "Mr. Gorringe," he said mildly, "how many blanks did you load last night?" "2, sir. Only 2 were needed. I always check them myself." "And after the incident?" "Well, one must have gone missing, sir. I never found it. I thought it had rolled somewhere." Purbright replaced the tin and smiled. Perhaps it did. They have a way of rolling into the most inconvenient places. He thanked Mr. Gorringe, left Constable Love to take a statement, and stepped out into the thin morning drizzle. Across the square, the Argus office door stood open, and a familiar figure waved him inside. It was Walter Bradby, the paper's editor, whose talent for smelling a story was rivaled only by his inability to keep one in proportion. "Morning, Inspector. Terrible business, eh? Whole town's talking. Was it sabotage, jealousy, political scandal?" Purbright set his hat on a chair. "It was, Mr. Bradby, a very regrettable interruption to the cultural life of Flaxborough. Beyond that, we must wait for the coroner." Bradby grinned. "Meaning you haven't the faintest yet?" "Meaning," said Purbright pleasantly, "that speculation in print tends to age badly." As he left, a headline proof caught his eye. "Tragedy strikes amateur drama. Gun goes off. Man dead." Beneath it, someone had penciled in an alternative. Mystery in black velvet. Purbright smiled faintly. The Argus would choose the latter. It was more flattering to the town's sense of refinement. Back at the station, Dr. Glendinning awaited him with a preliminary report. The doctor was a brisk, dry man whose medical opinions were invariably sound, though his sympathies for the living were limited. "Cause of death simple enough," he said. "Single bullet wound to the chest, entry at close range. Powder burns confirm the gun was fired from no more than 2 feet away." "So not a ricochet or theatrical misfire," Purbright said quietly. "Not unless your props department employs marksmen." Purbright thanked him and sat for a long moment in thought. Then someone, deliberately or otherwise, loaded that gun with a live round. The question is, why? Constable Love, returning from his errand, offered an unhelpful theory. "Maybe someone wanted to frighten him, sir. Just give him a scare." "People," Purbright observed, "who intend to frighten rarely choose bullets as their medium." He rose and reached for his coat. "We shall call on Mrs. Derry next." The late actor's house stood on a quiet street of well-trimmed hedges and quietly competitive curtains. Mrs. Derry opened the door, wearing mourning black that appeared to have been anticipated rather than purchased in haste. Her expression was composed, though her eyes held the hard glitter of someone rehearsing restraint. "Inspector," she said with a small bow, "you'd better come in. I expect you'll want to know who might have wanted him dead." Purbright inclined his head. "It is the usual starting point, Mrs. Derry." She led them to a tidy sitting room that smelt faintly of lavender and disapproval. On the mantel stood photographs of Colin in various guises: military uniform, Roman toga, and once, disturbingly, as a pirate with his arm round Mrs. Pomeroy. Purbright studied that one a moment longer than courtesy required. "My husband," Mrs. Derry said crisply, "was a devoted actor but a careless man. He confused admiration with affection and friendship with, well, opportunity." "I see," said Purbright gently. "And did any of these opportunities bear resentment?" She gave a thin smile. "Mrs. Pomeroy might know." As they left, Purbright paused at the gate. "Love," he said, almost to himself, "our late Mr. Derry seems to have been much admired, but not universally so. We may find that the stage wasn't the only place he was performing." The constable nodded, puzzled but impressed. Purbright's gaze lingered on the overcast sky, where a thin break in the clouds let through a stripe of pale light, like the first hint of an opening act yet to unfold. Inspector Purbright preferred his investigations to unfold like conversations rather than campaigns. The business with the prop gun, though attracting a certain civic fascination, remained to him a matter of human routine, people being people, even when armed with theatrical weapons. After visiting Mrs. Derry, he walked slowly back toward the town hall, umbrella resting on his shoulder, thinking of how swiftly gossip constructed its scaffolding around uncertainty. By the time he reached the square, it was apparent that the town had already decided upon its villain. Mrs. Pomeroy, naturally, because she had that artistic temperament, which in Flaxborough was synonymous with untrustworthiness. The town hall caretaker, a stooped man named Biddle with a lifelong mastery of appearing invisible, intercepted him in the corridor. "Beg pardon, sir, but I thought you might want to see what I found this morning." From his pocket, Biddle produced a small object in tissue paper, an empty cartridge case, slightly dented, faintly oily. "It were under the chaise longue where the body was. Thought maybe it mattered." Purbright turned the casing over in his fingers. "It does matter, Mr. Biddle. Everything that shouldn't be there, or that's too neatly there, usually does." He thanked the man, slipped the case into an envelope, and returned to the stage, which now looked bare and penitential. A few chairs remained stacked near the wings, their shadows long in the morning light. He stood a while, gazing at the spot where Colin Derry had fallen. The absurd black velvet curtain still hung in place, an elegant shroud for a tragedy of provincial scale. Mrs. Pomeroy arrived soon after, her face pale and lips determinedly painted. She was the sort of woman who believed good grooming could repel calamity. "Inspector," she said, "I hardly slept. It's monstrous, absolutely monstrous, that anyone could suggest negligence. I've devoted 20 years to bringing art to this town." Purbright inclined his head sympathetically. "And you have succeeded, Mrs. Pomeroy. Art has certainly paid us a visit, though it seems it preferred tragedy to farce." She clasped her handbag as though for reassurance. "If you think I'd risk my reputation over a man like Colin, well, you don't know me at all." Her voice cracked slightly. "He was a talented actor, yes, but he was careless, always improvising, always changing things at the last minute. You can't run a production like that." "Quite." Purbright's tone was neutral. "And did he often bring his own props? Costumes, perhaps? Or anything from outside the theatre?" She hesitated. "Sometimes. He was proud of his contribution. The revolver, for instance. It was his idea to use Mr. Gorringe's real one instead of the imitation. Said the audience could tell the difference." Purbright nodded slowly. "A purist. The stage demands authenticity, after all." She didn't notice the faint amusement in his tone. "I told him we had perfectly good props, but he insisted. You know how actors are when they think they've found a bit of business that gives them gravitas." "And Mr. Gorringe agreed?" "Oh, he adores Colin. Or adored him, I should say. Practically worshipped the man. They spent hours tinkering with that gun." Purbright made a small note in his pocketbook. "Did you happen to see either of them yesterday afternoon before the performance?" She looked uncertain. "Colin came early, about 6. Said he wanted to rehearse the final act privately. I assumed Gorringer was helping him." "Was anyone else in the building?" "Just the caretaker, I think. And myself, briefly. I left to fetch some programs from the printer." Purbright thanked her gently and let her go. As her heels clicked down the corridor, he watched the sway of her black coat and wondered how far self-preservation could pass for dignity. He met Constable Love outside the police station, the young man still damp from an attempt at efficiency. Sir, I've been to the gunsmith, Mr. Heston, up on East Gate. He says those blanks Mr. Gorringe used aren't blanks at all. They're ordinary 38 cartridges, just with their tips filed down a bit. Purbright stopped walking. Filed? Down, you say? That would still leave powder and charge intact. Yes, sir. Heston said they'd go off quite nicely, only the bullet might tumble instead of fly straight. Purbright's mouth twitched, which may explain Mr. Derry's failure to deliver his final line. He resumed walking, slower now. Love, we shall pay another visit to our props master. But before that, find out whether Mr. Derry owned a firearm. If he didn't, we must ask who had reason to keep him supplied. They returned to Gorringe's workshop, where the man was coiling a length of wire with excessive diligence. His face, shiny with sweat, lit up uneasily when he saw them. Inspector, anything new? Only confirmations, Purbright said. Tell me, these blanks you used, where did you get them? From the ironmongers, sir. Old stock cheap. Been using them for years. Never a problem. Did you test them? Not recently. Waste of good powder. Indeed. You see, Mr. Heston tells us they weren't blanks at all. They were live rounds. Gorringe went pale, the coil of wire slipping from his hands. Live? But that can't be. I've used them before. Purbright's tone remained gentle, almost apologetic. You may have been lucky before. This time someone was not. The man sank into a chair, muttering, I never meant. He looked up suddenly. Unless someone switched them. That's it. Someone swapped them after I loaded the blanks. They must have done. Who had access to the props cupboard yesterday afternoon? Only me, Mrs. Pomeroy, and Colin. But Colin wouldn't. He was the one using it. Purbright considered him for a long moment. Sometimes, Mr. Gorringe, people take risks to make sure their dramas feel real. The question is whether that risk was meant for effect or for outcome. When they left, Constable Love ventured, Do you think he's telling the truth, sir? I think, Purbright said, fastening his coat, that truth, like theatre, depends on timing and audience. They walked toward the river, where the drizzle had thickened to a fine mist. The inspector's thoughts moved quietly among motives and mistakes, like a fisherman teasing meaning from murky water. A man like Colin Derry, vain, attractive, half-faithful, collected admirers and adversaries in equal measure. Someone, perhaps, had decided to settle accounts under cover of art. Purbright paused on the bridge, gazing at the slow water below. Love, he said softly. In Flaxborough, murder never begins with hatred. It begins with embarrassment and ends when someone stops pretending. Love nodded, not understanding but satisfied. Purbright's eyes narrowed against the mist. The curtain on this act, he thought, had not yet fallen. The next morning arrived washed pale by drizzle and the subdued clatter of milk bottles on doorsteps. Flaxborough outwardly seemed to have resumed its rhythm, though conversation at every threshold was still tinged with theatrical tragedy. Inspector Purbright, who believed towns possessed their own metabolism for scandal, knew that gossip had reached the stage of digestion. Facts half chewed, flavors altered to taste. It was the ideal time to start asking questions again, when people's certainty had mellowed into storytelling. He began with a quiet call to the coroner's clerk, who confirmed the inquest would open the following Monday. That left Purbright 4 days to discern whether Colin Derry's death was folly, chance, or purpose. He had ruled out pure accident. Intention lingered, faint but steady, like a draught under a locked door. Constable Love joined him with his usual mixture of eagerness and mild bewilderment. Sir, I've checked with licensing. Mr. Derry didn't have a gun registered in his name, nor any record of buying ammunition. Then the live rounds did not come from him, Purbright said, lighting a cigarette he had promised Mrs. Purbright he'd abandoned. Which narrows our possibilities. to the man who loaded them, the woman who kept the keys, and any soul sufficiently imaginative to see opportunity in theatre. Love looked puzzled. "You think someone meant to kill him, sir?" Purbright blew a thread of smoke. "If they didn't, they chose a remarkably efficient way to express their affection." By mid-morning, they reached the modest office of the Flaxborough Argus. Walter Bradby was in high spirits, which to him meant less sarcasm than usual. "Ah, Inspector, just in time. We've had a letter, anonymous, naturally, claiming Mr. Derry was a man of divided loyalties. Says the police ought to look into his private life." Purbright accepted the envelope. The letter was written in block capitals, with the slant of someone anxious not to be recognized. Its message, brief and unhelpful, hinted that the dead man's romantic excesses had caused distress to a lady of standing. Purbright handed it back. "Remarkable how courage always finds paper but never a signature," he murmured. Bradby grinned. "It'll sell copies, though. You can't deny that." "I rarely try to interfere with commerce," Purbright replied mildly. "Only with its consequences." Outside, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle. He walked slowly toward the river, thinking about that lady of standing. In a town like Flaxborough, that description fitted perhaps 3 women, and of those, only one had both the temperament and the motive to send a letter at once spiteful and refined. Mrs. Pomeroy, he thought, would be incapable of using block capitals. Her vanity required loops and flourishes. That left perhaps Mrs. Derry herself, or someone who wished to appear as her avenger. At 11:30, Purbright and Love paid another visit to the Derry house. The widow received them with an air of prepared martyrdom, which she had perfected overnight. The curtains were half drawn as though to strike a balance between mourning and surveillance. "I expected you, Inspector," she said. "People have been kind enough to tell me that certain unpleasant rumors are circulating." "Rumors thrive on vacancy," Purbright replied. "Facts tend to leave them unemployed. You might help us correct that balance." She sat stiffly, hands clasped in her lap. "If it's about Colin's behavior, I make no pretense. He liked attention, women's attention mostly. I stopped taking it personally years ago." "Did Mrs. Pomeroy take it personally?" That brought a small, sharp smile. "Eunice Pomeroy takes everything personally. She's made an art of it, but she'd never harm him. She lives for public approval." "Then perhaps another admirer, someone less restrained." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "He flirted with that little shop girl from the milliner's. Beryl something. She was in the chorus last Christmas, but if you're suggesting she'd handle a gun, well, she can barely handle a teapot." "Nevertheless," said Purbright gently, "I should like to speak with her. Jealousy in Flaxborough is rarely theatrical, but it can be industrious." When they left, Love muttered, "She doesn't seem very upset, sir." "She's upset in the approved manner," said Purbright. "Black dress, sharp remarks, and composure at 5-minute intervals. Grief takes its tone from the audience." The milliner's shop was an oblong of pink displays and powdery mirrors. Behind the counter stood Beryl Lum, a small, pretty girl with the startled eyes of one unaccustomed to police enquiry. She looked both thrilled and alarmed to see Purbright. "Oh, Inspector, it's awful, isn't it? Poor Mr. Derry." "Indeed. You knew him well?" She hesitated. "Well, not well exactly. He helped me with my lines once. Said I had potential. He was ever so kind." "Kindness can be a demanding virtue," Purbright observed. "Did you see him on the day of the performance?" "Just for a minute. He came by to show me the gun. Said it made him feel like a real detective. I told him it frightened me." He laughed. Her hands twisted the edge of a hat box nervously. "He was different that day, Inspector. Sort of urgent. He said after the play everything would change." Purbright's expression didn't alter. "Did he say for whom?" She shook her head. He didn't have time. Mrs. Pomeroy came in looking for him, so he left. Outside, the inspector paused beneath the shop's striped awning. The rain made patterns on the pavement like faint handwriting. "Love," he said softly. Our leading man had plans. "Change," he said. "Change for whom, indeed?" They walked back toward the station, their boots clicking against the wet cobbles. Purbright said nothing for some minutes. Then, "You see the irony, love. Theatrical people strive for illusion, yet it's always the truth that kills them. Mr. Derry's life appears to have been one long rehearsal." Love, uncertain of whether this was philosophy or evidence, nodded solemnly. At his office, a message awaited from Dr. Glendinning. The pathologist's notes, concise and devoid of sympathy, stated that the bullet retrieved from Derry's body was not the standard issue of any British manufacturer. It was continental, smaller in caliber, possibly foreign surplus. Purbright reread the note twice. Foreign ammunition in a local gun, loaded by a cautious man under direction of an amateur dramatist. The combination felt uncomfortably deliberate. Someone had gone to trouble, not merely to kill, but to mislead. As twilight crept across the town, Purbright stood by his window watching the lamps flicker on along High Street. Somewhere beyond them, Mrs. Pomeroy was doubtless composing her next public statement. Mrs. Derry would be hosting her grief like a tea engagement. And Beryl Lum, poor girl, would be trying to remember whether kindness could ever be fatal. Purbright reached for his coat again. "Love," he said, "fetch the car. We're going to look at that props cupboard once more. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that in Flaxborough, secrets prefer velvet storage." The town hall lay quiet in the dusk, the kind of stillness that made even footsteps sound like intrusion. Purbright and Constable Love entered through the side door, the inspector's torch casting a muted cone of light along the corridor. The air carried a faint scent of varnish and cold velvet. Somewhere a clock ticked with officious precision, as though disapproving of policemen after hours. Purbright moved with his usual unhurried deliberation. "Love," he murmured, "notice how a building remembers its purpose. Even empty, this one expects applause." He smiled faintly and pushed open the door to the auditorium. The stage loomed ahead, bare now, stripped of its glamour. The black curtain hung lifeless, its edges brushing the floor where tragedy had performed its last act. Purbright's eyes swept the space, not for drama, but for the faint signatures people leave when they think no one is watching. He walked toward the props cupboard. Constable Love followed, clutching his notebook as if it might defend him. "Do you really think we'll find something new, sir? We've been through here before." Purbright unlocked the cupboard. "Ah, Love, murder is like amateur carpentry. The craftsman always believes he's sanded the surface smooth, but there's always one rough edge left to find." He opened the door wide. Inside, the familiar clutter of painted swords, fake fruit, and chipped masks greeted them. The revolver case was still where Purbright had last seen it, sealed and labeled for evidence. But on the lower shelf, among discarded bits of costume, a small box had shifted position. It was metal, slightly rusted, and bore a foreign label, the lettering faint but legible. "Cartouches, caliber 9mm, Fabrique Nationale, Belgique." Purbright lifted it gently. "Belgian," he murmured. "Dr. Glendinning's Continental bullet has found its birthplace." Love peered over his shoulder. "You mean the bullets didn't come from the ironmongers at all?" "Indeed not, and I doubt Mr. Gorringe has ever travelled farther than the seaside at Skegness." Purbright examined the box. 3 cartridges remained inside, nestled like secrets. "This," he said softly, "was placed here for a purpose. But by whom and when?" A faint sound broke the silence, a door creaking somewhere backstage. Purbright's head turned slightly, his expression unaltered. "We're not alone," he said mildly. "Do be so good as to stand behind something solid, Love." A figure emerged from the wings, carrying a broom. It was the caretaker, Biddle, looking rather more nervous than a man should about sweeping. "Oh, evening, Inspector. Didn't know you were here." Purbright regarded him kindly. "A conscientious man, working late. We all have our duties." Biddle nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Just keeping the place tidy. Mrs. Pomeroy wants it looking decent for the memorial service they're planning." "A touching tribute," Purbright said. "Tell me, Mr. Biddle, have you ever seen this box before?" He held it up, the torchlight glinting off the faded label. Biddle frowned. "Can't say I have." "Looks foreign, doesn't it? We don't use that sort of thing here." "Quite so. And yet, here it was, nestled among the biscuits and relics of local artistry. Curious, don't you think?" Biddle shifted uneasily. "Maybe one of the actors brought it. They collect all sorts of oddments." Purbright nodded, but his gaze lingered on the man's hands. Work roughened, yet stained faintly with what looked like oil. "You maintain the stage equipment, do you not?" "Ropes, lights, bits and pieces, yes. And firearms." Biddle's eyes widened. "No, sir, wouldn't touch those. Not my business." "Ah," Purbright said pleasantly. "But your business, Mr. Biddle, includes keeping keys. Tell me, how many keys are there to this cupboard?" Biddle hesitated. "3, sir. One with me, one with Mrs. Pomeroy, and one was kept here for convenience, on that hook by the door." Purbright glanced at the hook. It was empty. "Convenient indeed," he murmured. "And how long has it been missing?" "Couple of days, maybe," Biddle admitted. "Didn't think much of it." Purbright closed the cupboard and slipped the Belgian cartridge box into his pocket. "I dare say you didn't. Still, keep the stage locked from now on. The next drama we host should be properly rehearsed." They left Biddle mopping the same square of floor with exaggerated diligence. Outside, the rain had stopped. Street lamps shone through mist, turning puddles into small mirrors. Purbright paused on the steps, looking back at the darkened hall. "Love," he said quietly, "we have an imported bullet, a misplaced key, and a foreign cartridge box that arrived without customs declaration. I suspect our tragedy has traveled farther than Flaxborough imagines." The constable, eager to be helpful, ventured, "Could someone have brought the bullets as a souvenir, sir?" Purbright smiled. "A deadly souvenir, perhaps, but more likely a token of desperation. You see, love, people rarely import ammunition unless they also import trouble." Back at the station, he spread the items on his desk, the bullet casing from under the chaise, the foreign box, and his notebook of interviews. The pattern, though still indistinct, was forming. Colin Derry had enemies of convenience, not conviction, yet someone had converted inconvenience into motive. The telephone rang, slicing through the quiet. Purbright lifted the receiver. "Purbright?" A hesitant voice answered. It was Beryl Lum. "Inspector, I didn't know if I should ring, but something's been bothering me." "Go on, Miss Lum." "It's about the gun. When Mr. Derry showed it to me that day, I remember he said he'd been practicing with it at home, just clicking it, you know, to look natural, but he said the chamber felt stiff, like it hadn't been cleaned. He was going to ask Mr. Gorringe to check it before the show." Purbright's tone softened. "Did you tell anyone this before?" "No, sir. I didn't think it mattered. But then I remembered you asked about the afternoon. And, well, I saw someone leaving the town hall around then. A man in a dark coat. He was carrying a small case." "Could you recognize him?" A pause. "I think it was the caretaker." Purbright thanked her, replaced the receiver, and sat back. The clock ticked, steady as breath. Biddle, it seemed, had been tidier with his stories than with his flaws. He stood, putting on his hat. "Love," he called, "fetch the car again. We're paying Mr. Biddle a second visit before he sweeps our mystery quite out of sight." As they drove through the lamplit streets, Purbright felt that subtle tightening in his chest that accompanied progress. The case had not yet confessed its heart, but it had begun to speak, quietly, in the accents of fear and pretense. And somewhere behind the black velvet curtain, the true author of the evening's performance was waiting, patient as applause withheld until the final act. When Purbright and Constable Love arrived at the caretaker's cottage behind the town hall, the lights were on, but the curtains drawn tight. A faint glow leaked from the edges, pale and unsteady, as though the lamp inside were nervous of its own purpose. Purbright paused at the gate, observing the thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney. "Always comforting," he murmured, "to see domesticity in full retreat from conscience." Love looked puzzled. "You think he's in, sir?" "Oh, undoubtedly. Guilt rarely takes evening walks." Purbright knocked, 3 firm raps that were polite enough to suggest patience but loud enough to discourage hesitation. After a moment, the door opened a cautious 6 inches. Biddle's face appeared, pale and glistening. "Inspector, you again. I wasn't expecting company." Purbright smiled amiably. "We're all creatures of habit, Mr. Biddle. I, for instance, like to finish unfinished business. May we come in?" The caretaker hesitated, then swung the door wide. The room behind him was cramped but tidy, every object placed with the sort of precision that hints at anxiety rather than order. A kettle steamed faintly on the hob. The air smelt of tobacco and polish. "Do sit down," Purbright said, choosing a chair for himself and gesturing Love toward another. "We shan't detain you long. Only a few clarifications." Biddle sat opposite, his hands clasped, knuckles showing white. "I've told you all I know, Inspector." "Indeed you have," said Purbright pleasantly. "But knowledge is a curious thing. It tends to grow when watered with opportunity. Now then, Miss Lum tells me she saw you leaving the town hall on the afternoon of the performance, carrying a small case." Biddle's throat moved. "A case? Oh. Tools, likely. I take my tools home sometimes." "Prudent," Purbright murmured. "And did those tools include Belgian ammunition boxes by any chance?" The man flinched, then forced a laugh. "Ammunition? No, sir. Don't be daft. I wouldn't have anything like that." Purbright reached into his coat pocket and placed the metal box on the table. The lamp's glow made the foreign lettering gleam dully. "Then this must have come to us by post, though, curiously, the Royal Mail doesn't usually deliver into locked cupboards." For several seconds there was only the hiss of the kettle, Biddle's gaze fixed on the box as though it were something alive. "I don't know how that got there," he said finally, voice rough. "I never touched it." "Yet you had the means," Purbright said softly. "The missing key, the empty hall, and a stage gun already waiting for its cue. You had no quarrel with Mr. Derry, I suppose?" Biddle's mouth opened, closed again. He wasn't kind to me, laughed at me sometimes, called me the ghost of Flaxborough. But I wouldn't. No, it wasn't me." Purbright studied him, expression unreadable. "Tell me, Mr. Biddle, what did you do before you became caretaker?" The man hesitated. "I worked at the foundry before it shut down. Maintenance. Then for a while with a shipping firm in Hull. Only a few months." "Shipping," Purbright repeated. "So you would have had contact with foreign consignments, possibly even munitions?" Biddle swallowed. "A few crates now and then, yes. But that was years ago." "Memory can be surprisingly durable," Purbright observed, "particularly when it concerns what one has smuggled rather than shipped." The caretaker's hands twitched on his knees. "You can't prove." Purbright's voice remained level. "Prove what, Mr. Biddle?" Biddle blinked rapidly, then sagged, his shoulders collapsing like damp cloth. "I didn't mean for him to die," he whispered. "I only wanted to frighten him." Love leaned forward. "You loaded the gun?" Biddle nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. He'd been mocking me for weeks. Said I was too stupid to keep the place running. He was always strutting about, showing off for the ladies. I just wanted to scare him, teach him respect. I thought if the gun went off close by, he'd jump a mile. I never. Purbright's tone, still gentle, was edged with quiet certainty. You replaced the blanks with real cartridges from your old days in Hull. You used the spare key, set everything ready, and trusted chance to aim mercy. But chance, Mr. Biddle, is a terrible marksman. Biddle pressed a shaking hand to his forehead. I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't. It was just a joke that went wrong. Jokes, Purbright said softly, require laughter to be complete. This one ends in silence. He stood, motioning to Love. Constable, you'd better take Mr. Biddle to the station. Let him make his statement while it's still coherent. Love rose, uncertain, as though expecting an outburst. But Biddle merely nodded, defeated. As they left, Purbright paused in the doorway. One last question, he said quietly. Why not remove the evidence afterward? You had time. Biddle's voice was dull. I came back to clear it, but Mrs. Pomeroy was already there, crying over the stage. I didn't dare. Purbright gave a small nod. Conscience and fear, remarkably similar symptoms, though one tends to linger longer. At the station, after Love had escorted Biddle to the interview room, Purbright sat at his desk, staring at the rain streaking the window. A confession always brought a certain stillness, but not satisfaction. There remained, as there often did in Flaxborough, a suspicion that the truth had been shaded for decency's sake. He opened his notebook and reread his earlier jottings. Mrs. Pomeroy's indignation, Mrs. Derry's restraint, Beryl Lum's frightened recollections, each in their way had played a part. Yet something in Biddle's account felt rehearsed, neat, convenient, almost staged. He could hear the man's words echoing. I just wanted to frighten him. An echo of Purbright's own earlier observation returned with suspicious precision. He looked up as Love entered, flushed with accomplishment. He's signing the statement, sir. Said he's glad it's over. Purbright leaned back in his chair. Yes, Love, so am I, though one can't help wondering whether he's the only one relieved. The young constable frowned. You don't think he did it? Oh, he did it, Purbright said calmly. He pulled the strings all right, but I'm not yet sure who wrote the play. He extinguished his cigarette, then gazed once more at the rain-dark street outside. Somewhere beyond, Flaxborough was already making its peace with the tragedy, deciding which version of events would be most comfortable to remember. And Purbright, watching the blurred lights ripple across the glass, knew the curtain had not yet fallen on this performance. There was still one cue unspoken, one actor waiting just beyond the wings. The next morning arrived brittle and grey, as if the town itself had taken a vow of silence after Biddle's confession. The Argus ran a headline of restrained triumph. Caretaker admits gun switch, tragic mistake in Flaxborough Playhouse, and half the town read it with solemn nods, as though the case had been solved by divine inevitability. The other half merely enjoyed the scandal for its moral symmetry. An unimportant man, humiliated, avenging himself too far. It was the sort of story that let everyone else feel comfortably superior. Inspector Purbright, however, had no such comfort. The confession had been too tidy, the motives too neatly folded. Experience had taught him that true guilt rarely presented itself so housebroken. When he arrived at his office, he found Dr. Glendinning waiting with a face that suggested mild irritation rather than discovery. You'll want to know, the doctor said, that our Mr. Biddle's version doesn't quite fit the facts. The powder residue on Derry's jacket indicates the revolver was fired from nearly 4 feet away, not 2. And the angle, well, whoever pulled the trigger was standing rather higher than the victim. Purbright looked up from his chair, his expression one of polite surprise. So, our remorseful caretaker must be unusually long-armed, or else he wasn't on the stage at all. Quite. Glendinning buttoned his coat. Still, he seems convinced of his own guilt, which saves me the trouble of explaining the difference. Good morning, Purbright. After the doctor left, Purbright sat for several minutes, watching the smoke from his cigarette coil upward like thought itself. Thin, persistent, impossible to tidy. He reached for the telephone and called the station sergeant. Sergeant Malley, release Mr. Biddle from custody for now. Tell him to remain available for further questions. And please remove that Argus clipping from the notice board before the constables start believing it. Love entered shortly after, brimming with the misplaced satisfaction of youth. I saw the paper, sir. Whole town thinks you've wrapped it up. People say it's a mercy, poor man confessing. Yes, Purbright murmured. The British public has always admired economy and crime. It hates untidiness. He looked up. Tell me, love, did you examine the revolver's grip for fingerprints? Yes, sir, mostly smudged, but the lab did find a faint set that didn't match either Biddle or the victim. Did they, indeed? Purbright rose, straightening his tie. Let's take a stroll to Mrs. Pomeroy's. I should like to see how an artistic conscience performs in daylight. They found Mrs. Pomeroy at home, in a drawing room that looked like an illustrated sermon on taste. Lace antimacassars, china dogs, and a portrait of herself in theatrical costume. She received them with brittle dignity, the kind that rattles if moved too abruptly. Inspector, she said, arranging her expression into sorrowful composure. Such a relief to hear the matter settled. Poor Biddle, so unhinged, so, well, inadequate. Purbright regarded her mildly. You've a generous view of inadequacy, Mrs. Pomeroy. It often hides greater talents than it shows. But tell me, did you return to the theatre after the performance, the night of the incident? Her painted eyebrows lifted. Naturally. Someone had to see to the flowers, and to comfort the cast. It was chaos. Indeed. And when you were there, did you happen to touch the revolver? The revolver? She blinked, recovering quickly. I might have. I was tidying, you know. Such things can look frightful lying about. But surely that's of no consequence. Purbright smiled faintly. Most consequences begin with tidying. You see, the revolver carries a partial fingerprint, delicate but persuasive. We shall, of course, have it compared. For a moment, her poise slipped. A hand fluttered to her throat, and her gaze darted to Love, as if appealing to youth for gallantry. Inspector, surely you don't think— I think, said Purbright gently, that you cared a great deal for Mr. Derry, perhaps more than prudence advised. And I think you resented his intention to, shall we say, diversify his affections. Miss Lum, for instance. Mrs. Pomeroy's voice turned sharp, brittle again. That silly girl, don't be absurd. Colin was devoted to the theatre, nothing else. He told me so himself. Ah, said Purbright softly. Devotion is a dangerous word, Mrs. Pomeroy. It often dies of repetition. She stood suddenly, trembling not from fear but fury. You have no right to suggest such things. Purbright bowed slightly. No right, only a duty. But if it comforts you, I seldom act upon suggestion alone. The truth, you see, has a habit of waiting for formality. As they left the house, Love exhaled with the relief of escaping both perfume and tension. Do you think she did it, sir? Purbright walked in silence for several paces. Possibly, but women like Mrs. Pomeroy seldom commit murder directly. They prefer arrangement, composition, as she might call it. She may have orchestrated the scene, but someone else took the bow. They reached the high street, where shopkeepers were sweeping their thresholds and discussing justice over brooms. Purbright stopped at the post office. Love, I'd like you to do something discreet. Ask the postal clerk whether any foreign parcels arrived recently addressed to the town hall, or to Mrs. Pomeroy personally. Love looked puzzled, but nodded. Foreign, sir? Yes. Belgian, perhaps. By the time the constable returned, dusk had thickened into a soft drizzle. You were right, sir. Love said breathlessly. A small package came about 2 weeks before the performance. No sender listed, just a customs note for theatrical supplies. Mrs. Pomeroy signed for it herself. Purbright's expression did not change, though the faintest glimmer of satisfaction touched his eyes. Then our production had an imported prop department after all. Very good, love. I believe it's time we invited Mrs. Pomeroy to the station, purely for a rehearsal, of course. He turned toward the lamplit square, where the town hall's dark facade loomed faintly through the mist. Somewhere within those walls, he thought, vanity had dressed itself as art and called it love. The stage, the velvet curtain, the misplaced bullet, all had been props for something far older than theatre. The quiet desperation of those who cannot bear to be replaced. And as he lit his pipe, Purbright allowed himself a small, inward smile. The play was nearing its final act, and the audience, Flaxborough itself, was waiting for its curtain call. By the following afternoon, the drizzle had thinned to a weary mist that softened even the sharper edges of Flaxborough's rooftops. Inspector Purbright sat in his office with the serenity of a man who found thought more productive than haste. The room was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional rustle of papers as he reviewed the reports from Constable Love and the forensic lab. Every document merely confirmed what experience had already whispered. The evidence was neat, too neat, in fact, and the neatness itself was the flaw. At 2:30, Mrs. Pomeroy arrived at the station. She was dressed in mourning black again, though with a feathered hat so assertively dramatic it suggested she expected an audience. When she entered the interview room, she gave Purbright a thin, confident smile. "I hope this won't take long, Inspector. I meant to meet the vicar at 4 about the memorial service." Purbright gestured toward the chair opposite him. "We'll be as brief as clarity allows, Mrs. Pomeroy. Would you prefer tea or truth first?" She blinked, uncertain whether to smile. "I beg your pardon?" "Tea can wait, then," Purbright said mildly, folding his hands. "You told me yesterday that you might have touched the revolver while tidying after the performance. The forensic analysis confirms that your fingerprint is on the weapon. Just one, quite distinct, along the barrel." Mrs. Pomeroy's expression wavered, but soon regained its composure. "Yes, well, I told you that already. You can't possibly think that means anything sinister." "I rarely think anything sinister," Purbright said. "People, in my experience, make their lives complicated enough without adding villainy. However, I'm curious about a parcel you received 2 weeks before the performance. From Belgium." Her hand froze on the handbag in her lap. "A parcel?" "Oh, the one with the stage accessories. Mr. Gorringe mentioned needing realistic cartridges. I ordered them from a theatre supplier in Antwerp. Perfectly legitimate." "How very cosmopolitan of you," Purbright murmured. "May I ask why the parcel was addressed to you personally, rather than to the Dramatic Society?" Her eyes flickered. "Because I paid for it myself, of course. I often do. These productions run on generosity, Inspector." "Generosity?" Purbright echoed softly. "An expensive virtue sometimes. I ask because the ammunition in that parcel was not theatrical at all. Real cartridges. The kind found in Mr. Derry's gun." She stared at him, pale beneath her powder. "That's impossible. The shop must have made a mistake." "Perhaps," Purbright said with mild interest. "Or perhaps the mistake was local. The customs label described the contents as theatrical supplies, which would require someone to write it out. A personal touch, one might say." She gave a small, incredulous laugh. "Do you imagine I intended this tragedy? Good heavens, Inspector, Colin Derry was important to me." "Yes," Purbright said. "Too important, I think, to let go quietly." For a moment, her poise cracked. She leaned forward, hands gripping the edge of the table. "You don't understand. He promised he'd leave his wife, that we'd produce something together in London. Then he started avoiding me, sneaking off to see that silly girl from the milliner's. I wasn't going to let him make a fool of me. Purbright's voice remained calm. So you decided to frighten him, much as Mr. Biddle claimed he had done. You instructed him, perhaps, to switch the blanks, to teach your leading man a lesson. Her lips parted, then closed again. He told you that, did he? Poor, miserable little man. Always wanted to be noticed. Indeed, Purbright said quietly. And what better way than to take direction from the great Mrs. Pomeroy? I imagine you assured him it would be harmless, that it was merely to humble Mr. Derry before the final curtain. She sat back, trembling. I never said he should load it. I only meant, oh dear God, I only wanted Colin to be frightened, just enough to come running back. Purbright let the silence draw out until even the ticking clock seemed to hesitate. Then you see, Mrs. Pomeroy, that you and Mr. Biddle performed the same act, but in different scenes. He thought the idea his own. You thought him your instrument. Between you managed something neither intended. Her eyes glistened. You're twisting my words. I loved him. Of course you did, Purbright said gently. Love in Flaxborough is rarely distinguishable from ownership. Both demand permanence, and both, when disappointed, have rather theatrical endings. She stared at him, then whispered, What will happen to me? Purbright rose, collecting his papers. That will depend on the coroner's interpretation and the prosecutor's imagination. I suspect neither will be as flattering as your audience once was. When she was led away, Purbright returned to his office, where Love awaited him with an uncertain expression. So it was her, then, sir. She made Biddle do it. She persuaded him, Purbright said. Which is not quite the same thing, though the law will struggle to distinguish the nuance. Biddle supplied the action, but she wrote the script. Love frowned. And she'll go to prison for that? Perhaps. Or perhaps they'll call it manslaughter and decide her grief is punishment enough. He paused, tapping his pen against the desk. Flaxborough will forgive her in time. It always does. She'll become a warning whispered between cups of tea. Love looked thoughtful. Funny thing, sir. Everyone in this case said they only wanted to frighten someone. Purbright smiled faintly. Yes, Love. It's remarkable how often that ends in tragedy. Fear, after all, is a clumsy weapon. It tends to recoil. He leaned back, gazing out at the street, where townspeople were already walking briskly past the station, heads bent against the drizzle. The world, as always, was returning to its comfortable rhythm. Yet Purbright felt the familiar melancholy that followed each resolution, the quiet knowledge that behind every respectable door, new dramas were rehearsing themselves, waiting only for the right cue. Outside, the town hall bell struck 4. Somewhere in its shadow, Mrs. Pomeroy's memorial meeting would soon begin, transformed by gossip into moral instruction. Flaxborough would mourn Colin Derry for a few respectful weeks, then settle back into its tranquil hypocrisies. The curtains would be mended, the stage relit, and perhaps, given time, the dramatic society would even stage another production. Purbright closed his notebook with a soft snap. You see, Love, he said, murder in Flaxborough isn't committed out of hatred. It's what happens when love forgets to mind its manners. The next morning dawned with a brittle chill that seemed to tighten the very air. Flaxborough, having absorbed the news of Mrs. Pomeroy's confession, had entered that stage of communal reflection peculiar to small towns. The mixture of regret, fascination, and faint self-congratulation at having known all along that something wasn't quite right about her. Shopkeepers spoke of unfortunate women led astray by passion. And the vicar, with a tone of reluctant wisdom, remarked that artistry and sin have always been uncomfortable companions. Inspector Purbright, however, felt no satisfaction. Something in the matter still refused to sit comfortably. The conclusion was sound on the paper. Biddle's foolish complicity, Mrs. Pomeroy's manipulation, Derry's vanity. But Purbright had learned that moral architecture seldom mirrored fact so neatly. The pattern, he felt, had been composed too perfectly, like a play ending just before the last line was spoken. He sat at his desk, rereading Mrs. Pomeroy's statement. Her handwriting, neat and rounded, betrayed none of the agitation that had colored her voice the day before. She had admitted to ordering the Belgian cartridges, persuading Biddle to make the substitution merely to frighten, and nothing beyond that. But what tugged at Purbright's mind was the timing. The gun had fired 1 live round, leaving 3 in the foreign box. Yet the laboratory report, now before him, stated that the Belgian ammunition came originally as a set of 6. Where were the other 2? Constable Love entered with his usual mixture of enthusiasm and apology. "Morning, sir. Mrs. Derry called at the desk. She wants to collect some of her husband's belongings. I said we'd ask you first." Purbright glanced up slowly. "Did she, indeed? How very conscientious of her. She said she'd prefer to come by after lunch when the reporters aren't hanging about." Purbright smiled faintly. Always considerate of appearances. "Very well, love. We'll receive her at 2 o'clock. After the constable left, Purbright lit his pipe and stared out through the window. He pictured Mrs. Derry in her immaculate mourning, her composure wrapped tight as her veil. If Mrs. Pomeroy had been the emotional storm of the piece, Mrs. Derry was its calm, perhaps too calm. A woman accustomed to order rarely tolerates disruption unless she has prepared the replacement. When 2 o'clock came, she arrived precisely as promised, composed and faintly scented with violets. "Inspector," she said, with a small bow, "I do hope this won't take long. These last few days have been intolerable." Purbright gestured toward a chair. I can imagine. Loss is never tidy, though I find some people handle it with admirable efficiency." She gave a thin smile. "I've had practice in composure. It's expected of one, don't you think?" Purbright inclined his head. "Entirely. You've come for your husband's effects?" "Yes. There was a wristwatch, some keys, and his wedding ring." She paused delicately. "I'd rather not have the clothing." "Understandable. I shall have the constable fetch them for you. Meanwhile, perhaps you could indulge my curiosity." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "About what?" "Your husband's revolver. Mrs. Pomeroy insists he borrowed it from Mr. Gorringe. Yet you mentioned, when we first met, that he'd been practicing with it at home. Did he keep it there for long?" Her fingers tightened on her handbag. "A few days. He brought it back and forth during rehearsals. Why does that matter?" "Because," said Purbright gently, "if the revolver stayed in your house for any time at all, someone besides Mr. Derry might have had the opportunity to alter its contents." She met his gaze coolly. "Are you suggesting I tampered with it?" Purbright smiled faintly. "I suggest nothing, Mrs. Derry. I observe, for instance, that you seem more concerned with what I suggest than with what actually happened." Her composure wavered for an instant, but she recovered quickly. "I've had quite enough insinuations from your department, Inspector. You already have your culprit." "We have," Purbright agreed. "A confession. But confessions, I find, are often shared performances. Mrs. Pomeroy may have written the script, but I'm not entirely convinced she understood every line." Mrs. Derry rose abruptly. "I think this conversation has gone quite far enough." "Just one more question," Purbright said softly. "You knew your husband was seeing Beryl Lum, didn't you?" Her back stiffened. "A vulgar infatuation. It would have passed." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "Still, he told her that everything would change after the performance. You wouldn't happen to know what he meant by that." She turned, her face composed again, though her voice trembled faintly. "No. And if you're implying that I had anything to gain from his death, you're mistaken. He left me nothing but debt and embarrassment." Purbright inclined his head. "Then I must apologize for my curiosity. One never knows what people leave behind. Sometimes it's more than they intended." When she had gone, Love reappeared with a small envelope containing Derry's personal effects. Purbright examined them absently. Watch, keys, a single cufflink, and, tucked into the lining of the envelope, a stub of a foreign receipt, folded twice. He smoothed it out on the desk. The faded lettering read, Fabrique Nationale, Liège, 6 cartouches, calibre 9mm. So, 6. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. Mrs. Pomeroy claimed to have ordered the cartridges for theatrical use, but the receipt had been found not in her possession, nor in Biddle's, but with the dead man himself. A man who, only days before, had spoken of change. That evening, Purbright returned once more to the town hall. The stage was being readied for the memorial service. Rows of chairs, wreaths, and a large photograph of Colin Derry in heroic pose. Purbright stood at the edge of the stage, the black curtain stirring faintly in the draught, and said quietly to himself, not frightened, rehearsed. He looked toward the lighting rig where Biddle had worked. Single bulb flickered above the empty set, throwing restless shadows across the boards. He imagined Derry there that last night, gun in hand, playing a tragedy, perhaps not knowing, or perhaps knowing too well, that the act would end in more than applause. Purbright turned to leave, but paused. A thought, small and persistent, took shape. If Derry had bought those cartridges himself, then perhaps his death had not been intended for him at all. Or perhaps it had not been accidental at all. Outside, the mist was thick again, wrapping the square in its damp embrace. Purbright drew his coat close and murmured, "Every play requires an ending. The question is, did he write his own?" The morning after his visit to the town hall, Purbright arrived at the station unusually early. The sky above Flaxborough was a pale, rinsed grey, and the street still glistened faintly from the night's drizzle. He moved with quiet purpose, coat folded neatly over his arm, his expression thoughtful rather than weary. Constable Love, entering moments later with a paper bag of pastries, froze mid-step when he saw the inspector already at his desk. "Good heavens, sir," Love said, setting down the bag. "You've beaten the sun to work." Purbright gave a mild smile. "The sun, Constable, is dependable but unimaginative. I sometimes prefer the company of mysteries before breakfast." He tapped a file on his desk. "I've been reviewing the coroner's notes. They mention that the revolver's hammer was found half-cocked. Curious, don't you think?" Love blinked. "Meaning, he didn't fire it properly, sir." "Meaning," Purbright said gently, "someone may have staged the scene to suggest an accident. Mr. Derry might not have been quite so careless with props as we were led to believe." Love frowned, uncertain. "You think he meant to, well, do himself in?" Purbright looked up, his eyes mild but sharp. "No, Love. I think he meant to frighten someone else, and, as in all our little tragedies, the fright took the wrong direction." He rose, gathering his notes. "Fetch the car. We're calling on Miss Lum again. I believe she knows more about Mr. Derry's intentions than she realizes." The milliner's shop was just opening, the bell over the door giving a nervous jingle as they entered. Beryl Lum looked up from arranging hats in the window. Her face was pale, but there was a new steadiness in her gaze, as though the worst of her fear had settled into fatigue. "Oh, Inspector, I thought everything was over." "Over," Purbright repeated gently. "In Flaxborough, Miss Lum, things are rarely over. They simply become less fashionable to discuss." He nodded toward a chair. "You told me before that Mr. Derry said things would change after the performance. Did he ever explain what he meant?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not properly, but he said he'd found a way to get out. Out of his marriage, out of Mrs. Pomeroy's control, all of it. He said after that night, no one would hold him again." Purbright's voice remained soft. "Did he seem frightened?" "Not frightened exactly," she said slowly. "Excited. almost like he was planning something clever. He said people would think he was a fool, but he'd show them. Purbright nodded. And did he mention a letter? Her brow furrowed. A letter? Yes, Purbright said. A suicide note, perhaps, or an explanation. No, he never said anything like that. Her voice dropped. You don't think he meant to die, do you? I think, Purbright said, he meant to make others believe he might, which is a very dangerous performance to rehearse with live ammunition. He thanked her and left, his manner as courteous as ever, though his thoughts were sharpening. Outside, the air smelled faintly of damp stone and bread from the nearby bakery. He paused by the car, glancing at the square. Love, he said. A man who plans to scare his lovers and impress his audience might very well prepare a scene too convincing for his own safety. You mean he loaded the gun himself? Perhaps. But remember, 6 cartridges were purchased, 1 fired. That leaves 5. Mrs. Pomeroy received 3 in the parcel, yet one of those matched the bullet that killed him. The arithmetic leaves us 1 unaccounted for. I suspect our late thespian may have kept it as part of his script. They returned to the station, where Purbright sent for Biddle. The caretaker entered, looking subdued but calmer since his release. You wanted to see me, sir? Purbright gestured him to sit. Tell me, Mr. Biddle, when you checked the stage after the accident, did you notice anything near the revolver? A paper, perhaps? Biddle thought hard, frowning. Now you mention it, sir, there was a folded bit of paper under the table leg. I thought it was part of the script, so I tossed it in the bin with the others. Purbright's eyes flickered. And that bin, was it emptied? Next morning, sir. Collected with the hall rubbish. Purbright sighed. A small rueful sound. Flaxborough efficiency strikes again. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. Still, it confirms what I suspected. Derry staged his final scene to manipulate both women. His wife with guilt, Mrs. Pomeroy with panic. He meant to fire blanks, collapse dramatically, and let them believe he'd died. But he never realized 1 cartridge was real. Biddle's eyes widened. Then who? Who switched it, sir? That, Purbright said quietly, is the simplest question and the hardest to prove. Someone knew his plan, or guessed it. Someone who wanted him truly dead. He dismissed Biddle and turned to Love. Send word to Mrs. Derry. Ask her to come here this evening. Tell her we've found something belonging to her husband that requires identification. Love nodded, though his brow furrowed with confusion. But we haven't, sir. No, said Purbright, smiling faintly. But I'm certain she'll bring it with her. That evening, when Mrs. Derry entered the station, she was as poised as ever, her mourning black impeccable. Inspector, she said coolly, what is it now? Purbright gestured to a chair. We've uncovered new details about your husband's death. It seems he planned rather an elaborate trick. He intended to fire a blank cartridge during the play, to alarm you and Mrs. Pomeroy both, perhaps even to free himself from certain attachments. Her face did not change. How clever of him. Yes, Purbright said, watching her closely. Except that one of those blanks wasn't a blank at all. It had been replaced with a live round. Only someone who knew his plan could have ensured that. She drew herself up. If you're implying— Not implying, Purbright interrupted gently. Merely observing that you, Mrs. Derry, were the only person who had that revolver in your home long enough to make such a substitution. You knew his vanity, his theatrics. You knew he'd use it for that scene. Her composure fractured, a tremor in her voice. He deserved it. He humiliated me, parading that woman about, making me a laughingstock. I didn't plan to kill him. I only wanted him to suffer the fright he'd planned for us. Purbright regarded her with calm sadness. You succeeded, I think, beyond expectation. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. If he hadn't lied, if he hadn't said he was leaving her, none of it would have happened. Purbright rose, his tone grave but courteous. Tragedy rarely requires villains, Mrs. Derry. Only participants who mistake pride for justice. When she was led away, the inspector stood a long while in the dim corridor, listening to the rain begin again outside. Constable Love approached hesitantly. "So it wasn't Mrs. Pomeroy after all, sir?" "Oh, she wrote the first act," Purbright said quietly. "But Mrs. Derry finished the play. Between them, they've ensured it'll be remembered." He reached for his hat, voice soft as the rain on the windows. "It seems, Love, that in Flaxborough, love and murder share a single stage, and the curtain never truly falls." Morning broke over Flaxborough in pale, apologetic sunshine, the kind that struggled to redeem what had gone before. The rain had washed the square clean of yesterday's gossip, but not of its residue. Already a few early risers were lingering by the Argus window, pretending to read the headlines, but quietly hoping for names. Inside the police station, Inspector Purbright sat with his customary cup of lukewarm tea, the steam curling faintly upward like a tired ghost. Constable Love entered, brisk but subdued, the morning paper tucked under his arm. "It's all in here, sir," he said, laying it on the desk. "They've printed the full story. Double deception in Flaxborough tragedy. They've even quoted your remarks to the coroner." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Ah, yes. The remarks I didn't make." Love smiled uncertainly. "People seem relieved, though. The town's settled. They like it when everything makes sense." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Sense is comforting, even when it's only approximate." He picked up the newspaper, skimmed the familiar account. The jealous wife, the misguided lover, the foolish caretaker, each playing their part in a comedy that turned to tragedy. Yet beneath the neat lines and official closure, Purbright saw what no report could print, the quiet absurdity of lives that had tangled themselves into melodrama without ever meaning to. "Tell me, Love," he said, setting the paper down. "What do you make of it all?" The young constable hesitated. "I suppose it shows, sir, that people shouldn't play with things they don't understand. Guns or love or both." Purbright's eyes warmed. "A concise sermon. The vicar will be out of work." He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the square where the market stalls were being set up again. The butcher's van was back in its usual place. Mrs. Teal was already arguing about the price of haddock. Life, in its tidy, ridiculous way, had resumed. Behind him, Love said softly, "Do you think she meant to kill him, sir? Mrs. Derry, I mean." Purbright was silent a moment. "No," he said finally. "Not consciously. But intent isn't always a matter of will, Love. It's sometimes only a matter of allowing what we wish to happen. She knew her husband well enough to predict his trick, and too well to resist letting it fail." Love frowned. "You mean she counted on him being foolish enough to die?" "Not counted," Purbright said, turning back. "Merely permitted. There's a distinction, though not one that comforts a jury." He sat again, folding his hands. "It's a peculiar thing, Love. The women in this affair, Mrs. Pomeroy and Mrs. Derry, each sought control over the same man, and in the end, neither gained it. Derry's death made them both irrelevant. Even Biddle's little part, his guilty imagination, served only to tidy the edges of their tragedy." Love looked uncertain. "You don't think they were evil, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Evil is such a large word for such small intentions. No, Love, they were merely human, ambitious, wounded, and desperately afraid of being ignored, which in Flaxborough is the one crime no one forgives." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Dr. Glendinning, brisk as ever, a sheaf of papers in hand. "Morning, Purbright. The coroner's verdict is in. Manslaughter, of course. They've recommended leniency for Mrs. Derry, given her distress. Rather generous, considering the distress she caused." "Generosity," Purbright said mildly, "is the luxury of the uninvolved." Glendinning snorted. Quite. You'll be relieved to know the town council intends to dedicate next month's play to her husband's memory. Something cheerful, I hope. Let us pray for pantomime, Purbright said gravely. When the doctor had gone, Love looked up. Will you attend, sir? Purbright's eyes drifted to the window again. I expect so. It's important to encourage the arts. Besides, the people of Flaxborough have short memories but long habits. They'll feel safer once they've laughed again. Love nodded and stood, gathering his cap. I'll see to the reports then. When the young man had gone, Purbright remained seated a long while, the room quiet, but for the scratch of a pen and the faint murmur of rain beginning again outside. He reached for his notebook, turning back to his earliest entry on the case. The night of the performance, the stage lights, the black velvet curtains stirring in the draught. It seemed a lifetime ago, though only days had passed. He wrote, slowly and deliberately. Case concluded. Cause of death, a collision of vanity and love. Motives insufficiently criminal but tragically adequate. He paused, then added, human nature, unchangeable, though endlessly rehearsed. Closing the notebook, Purbright allowed himself a small, tired smile. A good show, he murmured, echoing Mrs. Pomeroy's old words. Pity about the ending. Outside, the town hall bell struck 11. The sound drifted across the square, mingling with the chatter of shopkeepers and the rumble of a milk lorry. Flaxborough, decent and decorous once more, was busy turning yesterday's tragedy into tomorrow's anecdote. Purbright rose, straightened his tie, and reached for the day's new stack of paperwork. There would be council minutes to read, a missing bicycle to investigate, perhaps even a report about a stray dog in the churchyard. The world, after all, continued its quiet farce. And as he settled back into his chair, pen poised over the next dull form, he reflected, not without affection, that in a town like Flaxborough, even murder managed to be respectable, provided it was tidily resolved and politely forgotten. The kettle on the radiator gave a small, companionable hiss. Purbright poured himself another cup of tea, cooled it with a thoughtful breath, and began the day's ordinary work.